All right, I want to start today with what's happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where once again we have another major flare-up and no clarity at this time whether this will be on the order of weeks or months in duration or possibly even longer. Now, normally I would just jump right into the story and what's going on and my perspective. But because of what I came into my office to this morning, dozens and dozens of emails and messages from people speculating as to why I haven't talked about this yet, making all sorts of accusations and allegations, some of them very just sort of sad in terms of what they imply people think is my life on sort of a day-to-day basis. And I've not spoken about this recent flare-up much yet, only 3 times on a recent bonus show and a couple times on recent live streams. I've not spoken much about it yet because I've not felt that I have much to add or say that's different from my analysis the last time we talked about it. But I received a couple of emails from longtime viewers respectfully saying, this feels like it could be different this time and it would be great for you to update your take on what's going on. And so I'm going to do it. I also received dozens of furious and often emails playing on anti-Semitic tropes, referring to me as a Zionist Jew pig, and things that are even worse that I won't say because of our radio affiliates, so that they don't have to bleep things. And people saying everything from, you are not talking about it because you're scared you'll be exposed as the Zionist pig that you are, or it's financial reasons or whatever. So I'm under no illusion that those people will be satisfied with this segment unless I unilaterally put the sole blame for a 70-year conflict at the hands of genocidal evil Israel. And anyone who knows me knows I would never give such childish black and white takes on any issue. And so those people who have been emailing me saying I deserve to lose my show because I haven't yet talked about it, I'm sure will shift to saying I should lose my show because of what I say today. This segment is not for them, clearly. There were some really wacky things being emailed to me, maybe on other platforms as well. I've really only looked at emails, but maybe things are crazy on the Discord or on Reddit. I don't know. People saying, well, clearly I'm not saying anything because I'm afraid of the blowback from taking a position my audience won't like. That's never stopped me before on the show. What I have said before is if there's an issue that's unnecessarily inflammatory that most of my audience seems not to care about, I would consider skipping it. But I've done dozens of segments on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Then I got emails saying, David, you should really have the courage to do what this other Jewish person did and that other Jewish person. They were able to put aside their Jewish bias and take the correct view on this, which is Israel is the only problem, and Israel in some cases even should not exist, as some people emailed me. David, why does your Judaism blind you? You can't be a fair arbiter here because you're Jewish. This is the same argument that right-wingers made during the fight for gay rights, saying, of course, gay people want gay marriage. They're biased. You can't listen to them. They can't get past their personal connection to the issue. And it borders on anti-Semitic because it plays on the trope of a dual loyalty, that American Jews have a conflicting loyalty to Israel. Most Jews, of course, have never been to Israel. I've been there once 6 years ago. I don't live there. You won't be able to engage with me on things like, can't you put aside your Judaism and take the correct position? That's an identity politics rabbit hole. It's trash, and I don't engage in that. So I want to focus on what's been taking place. Now, one last thing, and again, I hate that I even have to do this, but you should see what I stepped into in my inbox when I got in this morning. I also got emails saying, David, you're motivated by money. So you want to avoid losing money if you give an unpopular take. And so that's why you're hiding your view on the subject. And some people writing and saying, David, you used to cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because you had a smaller audience and you made less money. Now there's too much money at stake. I'm going to ignore for a second, again, the anti-Semitic trope of Jews and money to say that over time, as the show has been more and more successful, financial considerations are less and less a part of anything I do at this point. I never chose stories based on money. I chose stories based on, do I feel like talking about it? Do I feel like I have something to add? Is this something my audience would be interested in? That's it. It's just my show and I pick the stories every day. Financial incentives never dictated story choice. They especially don't right now. And by the way, if lots of people are interested in the topic, then doing the story would bring money no matter what I say. Hate watching is still watching. It still makes just as much money. So it's not only an incorrect take, it's wrong on the facts as well. All of that now out of the way, all of the reasons why I've not been not doing a story now out of the way, let's talk about what's going on. And if you want to engage with me on this, engage with what I'm actually saying, not anything else that you're bringing in, okay? There are arguably two catalysts to this flare-up, and both have Israel to blame. Both have Israel to blame. Both have Israel to blame. Can I find ways to maybe say the catalysts are more two-sided? I could, but they feel disingenuous to me. The narrow catalyst for this flare-up is Israel. The first is that a squad of Israeli police officers entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This is a very volatile place. I was there a few years ago. Non-Muslims are only allowed at Al-Aqsa during certain time periods. Then, I don't know what's going on now. I was lucky to be there at just the right time. We were allowed in. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is controlled by the Jordanian Authority within the old city of Jerusalem, one of the most interesting places I've ever been. The old city in general and Al-Aqsa itself, fascinating historical places. A squad of Israeli police officers entered the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, brushed the Palestinian Jordanian attendants aside, went across the courtyard and cut the cables to loudspeakers that were broadcasting prayers during Ramadan. Disastrous idea. Now, why did they do it? The explanation is the Israeli president, not prime minister, the Israeli president was delivering a speech at the Western Wall on Israeli Memorial Day. You had Ramadan prayers conflicting with a Memorial Day speech, so the speakers were cut. It's a terrible idea. Now, you can argue, and unfortunately, this is how intractable this conflict is, where many of us would say, oh, come on, just, give this speech somewhere else or turn down the music or whatever, turn down the prayers or whatever. That's not the way this conflict works. And if you've been following the 70 plus year history of it, you would see why this explodes. But I understand thinking, how is that what was the first catalyst? Then we had the upcoming eviction of 6 families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. That led to protests. Then there was a police raid on the Al-Aqsa Mosque on May 7th. Police officers with tear gas, stun grenades, rubber-tipped bullets went into the mosque compound around 8 p.m. local time. And this set off hours of clashes with protesters. There were hundreds of injuries, according to medics that were on site. As reported by the New York Times, the police say that the stone throwers started it. Worshippers are saying the Israeli police started it. And then things exploded as usual. Each side has their own view on who the real wrongdoers are and who is merely reacting to the other side. Another intractable a bedrock of every single one of these flare-ups. And there's plenty to go around. Dozens and dozens of Hamas rockets coming over from Gaza, even reaching Tel Aviv. Israel doing bombings, as is always the case. Israel's actions leading to more death. Now, let me say one thing about this whole disproportionate response thing that often is mentioned. Yes, Israel's response is disproportionate. That's absolutely true. Israel is far better armed than the Hamas terrorists in Gaza. That's absolutely true. And whenever this happens, there tend to be more deaths as a result of Israeli action. That's absolutely true. And that's horrible. I think that we should also be honest with ourselves that some of the people who say, well, if 6 Palestinians die and 1 Israeli dies, it's a disproportionate response. I don't think they would be pleased if the numbers were the same. I mean, would we really be seeing a different reaction from people if 12 Palestinians and 12 Israelis died? Would that no longer be a factor? I don't think so. So, of course, the response is disproportionate. Disproportionate responses are a common thing in many conflicts. Ethnic, political, military, etc. It doesn't mean it's good, but to focus on that when obviously the side that's better armed is likely to do more damage, I don't think it helps us understand what's going on any better. Now, then Israel did another completely harebrained thing, blowing up a building in which the Associated Press was working in Gaza, saying there were Hamas there. Now, maybe there were Hamas, maybe they weren't. Israeli authorities did call and say, get out because we're going to hit this building. Whatever is the case, Hamas is in all sorts of different places, and it just seems idiotic to me to target this building because it does exactly what Israel's opponents want to say Israel does, which is suppress criticism and news of what's happening in Gaza. And in some literal sense, that's exactly what happens when you blow up a building out of which the AP is working. So disastrous idea, absolutely condemnable. So let's go through these things first, and I'll tell you where I stand, and pay close attention because, again, I'm not going to engage in responses that mischaracterize what I say. I am and have been against evictions and settlements, period, for the 25 years I've been following this conflict. There's no mitigator. I'm against it. I condemn it. This current Israeli government makes me sick and has for a long time, and settlements are a big part of that. One thing that is important and that tons of people are missing are that much like the Palestinian people are different from Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and the ultra-radical Palestinians, the Israeli people, Israel as a country, and the current administration are three different things. When during the Iraq war years, some Europeans wrongly saw all Americans as warmongers who wanted to go to Iraq, we all understood why that didn't make sense. We know the difference intuitively between the Trump administration, the United States as a country, and Americans as individuals. And yet more than half the emails I received about this don't seem to understand or make that distinction between the Netanyahu administration, Israel as a country, and the Israeli people, using the three terms interchangeably. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on. How can we even have a remotely sensible conversation about this conflict if you interchangeably assign blame or characterize three separate entities, the current administration, Israel as a country, and the Israeli people as one and the same? The evictions from East Jerusalem are at the heart of this, and I'm 100% against that. They are illegal by international law, period. Settlers are radical extremists. I share nothing with them. I am diametrically opposed. Settlers are a tiny fraction of Israeli Jews who are just a portion of world Jews. Unless someone says I'm for the settlements, I assume that they are not, because this is such a radical and relatively fringe group. Settlers are, in a sense, massive provocateurs, shameless ones at that. And sadly, right now, the Netanyahu government is benefiting from the settlers. And so they are allowing this to happen. Second, I am 100% against the Netanyahu government, which I believe is allowing this to happen for the benefit of Benjamin Netanyahu. The depraved and disgusting right-wing prime minister, Netanyahu, knows his days are numbered. He was unable to form a government. So he is allowing this to happen now because this is how he operates. Look at the chaos. You need me. He pulled this before an election some years ago. Now, this is when maybe some people want me to start saying, who is to blame and to what degree? David, please say this conflict is 99% Israel, or say it's all Hamas, or you are a Hamas sympathizer. Nothing is that simple. What I will tell you is what I see as the most likely path to peace for the long term. And it requires both Netanyahu and Likud not to be in power on the Israeli side, and somehow for Hamas to be removed from power in Gaza, but not replaced by Hezbollah, which is essentially as bad but better armed. So here's my perspective. If you said, what is the most likely path to peace? And this is why I didn't have much to say initially in this, because fundamentally the path to peace has not changed in my view. So starting with the big picture, anyone who thinks that there should be no Palestinian state in the future is just not a productive participant here. The Palestinians need a state of their own, a contiguous one, which I will get to. Anyone who thinks there should be no country of Israel is also not a productive participant. And if you really want to see a situation where many people would die, it would be a real attempt by serious players to make Israel no longer a country. So the Palestinian people deserve a state and to live in peace. and the Israeli people do as well. And right now, neither side is being led by those who benefit from peace or who want it. Until that changes, nothing will change. So the first question is, who's in charge in a hypothetical peaceful situation? In Israel, it's not Netanyahu and it's not Likud. Okay? On the Palestinian side, Hamas must be replaced by a more secular Palestinian authority immediately. Hezbollah replacing Hamas won't get us to serious peace possibilities. Does Mahmoud Abbas have a role to play there, currently overseeing the West Bank? Maybe. I'm open to that. It doesn't seem Hamas is open to that. When you look at how long Abbas has been around, I think you can also increasingly make the case that Abbas is not a likely arbiter to a longer term peace. Abbas has also given, lie-riddled speeches at the UN. So has Benjamin Netanyahu. To the extent that Abbas might be a productive partner, I'm open to it being a Mahmoud Abbas-led coalition government, West Bank and Gaza. But I don't know how feasible that really is. In all likelihood, you are going to need to have the law of return for Jews to Israel maintained and a law of return established for the future Palestinian state. Now, the entire point of Israel is, since Jews were kicked out and discriminated of so many parts of the world for so long, that's a place Jews know they can go, even if Hungary turns extremely right-wing anti-Semitic or whatever the case may be. There also is going to have to be, I believe, some ability for Palestinians to return to Israel. Something's going to have to be conceded. Mathematically, and this is something Yasser Arafat talked about in the 90s, it's not going to be 5 million Palestinians. It's just not going to happen. So we need a combination of some reasonable Palestinian return to what will be the state of Israel. Certainly, the Palestinian state will be able to decide who is allowed to go there as well. Anyone who wants to move back to Gaza or the West Bank would be free to do so if the Palestinian Authority wants to allow it. Now, Ehud Barak in the past proposed a symbolic number of Palestinian return to Israel and significant financial reparations. That's something that could be looked at. But that's more details once we get past sort of the big questions. In terms of the land, what are the borders, right? I believe the most likely path to peace will come with something that is more or less the Clinton proposed borders, or similar, which is similar to a lot of the recent ideas, not the Trump ideas. Forget Trump. Anything Trump said is in the trash. The Palestinian territory would include the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Yes, East Jerusalem. There are some problems with exactly what the limits of East Jerusalem would be because they are disputed. But let's imagine if we got to this point, they could be agreed upon. East Jerusalem would become the capital of the Palestinian state. I think that has to be conceded. And the caveat would be the Jewish quarter of East Jerusalem should remain under Israeli sovereignty. We could do just a whole show on this, but if you look at the desecration of the Jewish quarter when it was not under Israeli control from, I believe, 49 to 67, you can read more about that. I think that is a caveat. On settlements, I mean, just all settlements have to stop immediately. Israel has to agree in principle to remove settlements that can be removed, and to offer meaningful land swaps for those that cannot. Now, as a practical reality, and I also go back to what Arafat said about this, not all the settlements at this point can be realistically removed. I hate that. That's disgusting. But if you say, David, you're the pragmatist negotiator, morally, I have no problem with removing every settlement. And I know the talking point is, well, these are people's homes. Yes, they're people's homes that were built in violation of international law, and they never should have been built. Yasser Arafat had the idea that keeping the larger settlements in exchange for meaningful land swaps would be okay. That's probably something that would have to be negotiated. And then certainly, on the other hand, all settlements have to stop. I believe the blockade has to be lifted to Gaza. You do have to have some way of preventing weapon materials from being brought in. It has to be negotiated, but the blockade, as a sign of good faith, at least initially, has to be lifted, of course. Palestinians have to immediately, all Palestinian groups have to stop all rockets immediately, stop the tunnel building, so on and so forth. Hamas and other groups have to demilitarize Gaza as part of a peace agreement. We saw in the 2-year period after the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza, but before the blockade was put in place, thousands of rockets. So there has to be a demilitarization, but the Gaza blockade has to be removed. And as long as the demilitarization and no rockets are held to, the blockade has to be removed. How do you hold people to that? I don't know. That has to be figured out. And then lastly, the eventual peace agreement has to include that all claims are being renounced and it is the end of the conflict period. Because the problem you run into is you have some sort of an agreement in principle, but not all claims are renounced. And then when the agreement is violated, everybody goes back to pretending like this was never identified as the end of the conflict. If there's going to be a serious deal, once the right players come to the table, and as I already mentioned, who those are is complicated, it has to be determined that that is the end of the conflict. And in the future, that allows any violator of the agreement, either on the Israeli or the Palestinian side, to be held to account. Some non-binding thing is not going to get us what we need. If you want to react, address these specific points. All insults, anti-Semitic responses, blanket replies like what I had over the weekend in my email, Zionist pig, it's all going to be ignored. The winners here are Netanyahu and Hamas. Chaos from which Netanyahu can say, you need me to protect you, that's a gift. Hamas justified in its brutal grip on the Gazan people because look at what Israel is doing to us. We're the only ones who can respond with the rockets. The Palestinian people lose here. The Israeli people lose. Bibi wins and Hamas wins. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.